Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Wes Trueblood, here to talk to you today about the UN, the global liberal order, liberal as in classical liberal or freedom movement as opposed to American liberal or Democrat, and what it means that it's now that it's coming apart, the UN, all of its programs, and what this shift to a civilizationalist or power-based projection means for not only America but for the world and how it might affect you. I'll give you my opinion as well, and hopefully by the end you'll have formed one of your own. So to get started, let's talk a little bit about what this is. What is the liberal world order? Well, again, as I said just a moment ago, we're talking about the liberal world order as in freedom. Remember, the word liberal comes from liberalism, or to liberate, to make free. That's the root of where this world comes from. So when we're talking about on a global scale, the movement, liberal movement towards liberty is freedom from the typical class system, freedom from slavery, serfdom, all of these other things that were very popular throughout the majority of Europe and even to a certain extent within the United States for a short time after our founding. That does not include, we're not going to touch on the subject of chattel slavery or any of those types of things. We're going to talk about this in the classical sense, and that's why the word is being used as the liberal world order. It doesn't mean liberal as in the Democrat Party of the United States of America or the modern leftist movement or woke politics. So, the UN came about based on the League of Nations, which was originally installed to help countries talk through their differences. Some of the key differentials between the League of Nations and the UN included things like peacekeeping forces and the desire to promote Western democracies and values around the world. We're going to talk also a little bit about how that changed and why that changed and what it did to the UN and all of its functions and why we're paying the price for that now in just a little bit. So, in order to help prevent wars on the scale of world wars, the idea was the nations of the world would come together and that they would all have essentially the same desire to prevent a war like this from happening again. There were a few things that we put together in order to make that happen, and some of those were promotion of different cultures, promotion of different nation states, promotion of ideologies, and unfortunately it didn't quite stay that way. It really kind of morphed and twisted into something as it got more and more liberal in the not classical sense in its worldview, bent towards socialism, kind of social justice, and the more it bent in that direction, the further and further it got from its original charter. And that has really harmed not only the UN, but us as Americans specifically, and we're going to talk about why that is. So, let's take a look at the overall idea of what was the liberal world order supposed to be. So first of all, the liberal world order was supposed to be a defender and promoter of Western values and democracy. Now, this was basically our way of saying we want the world to come towards a more democratic reality. We want democracy, not communism, not fascism, not socialism. We want a democratic rule where people are able to vote on who they want to operate their country and who they want to represent them. It was supposed to be an international peacekeeping force. That means all of the nations of the world would come together in order to stop conflicts before they became problematic and they scaled up and escalated to the point of becoming world conflicts. We were promoters of development in undeveloped countries. Now, that is going to become a touch point in a little bit when we start talking about what went wrong. I want you to go ahead and keep that one in your mind. The other idea was that all nations, regardless of size, are equally important and have a voice. Again, I want you to really key in on these things because these are the ideals, and unfortunately they got twisted and warped into something that they weren't supposed to be. Another thing they said was that all cultures are to be respected as the cultures of their respective countries. Again, another thing that got twisted as the UN became not just a group of countries working together to achieve a common goal, but began to become a global government structure where they wanted to create a globally hegemonic system that would almost create, in effect, a world government. Well, what went wrong? Well, one of the things that happened is they decided that Western values were the enemy. Now, this came about in a number of different ways, but ultimately what it came down to was countries didn't want to be Western. They didn't want that way of life. They wanted to be more laissez-faire, or they wanted to be collectivist, or they wanted this or they wanted that. Now, again, each country has a right to be who it wants to be and what it wants to be, but the point of the UN was to help promote those things within those countries. Also, another thing that went wrong was that instead of everybody pitching in together to be a global peacekeeping force, you ended up with a lot of American global policing due to other countries around the world downsizing their military. So they thought, hey, we have the UN to protect us, we have NATO to protect us, and we'll go ahead and downsize our military because we know that the Americans have a bigger enough military to take care of things. And so the Americans ended up shouldering the burden of world policing instead of the UN itself. Now, American presidents and administrations sold this to us on the basis of, we don't want to be throwing America's time, treasure, and people under the control of foreign groups and global governments. We want to take control of them, so we're just going to go ahead and take care of it ourselves. Unfortunately, what we also did is abdicate the responsibility of these other countries to participate and join us, and except for the big events such as the times that we went to war with Iraq, the different areas such as the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and so on and so forth, we ended up having America doing the policing around the world. And even within those events, those large events that happened, it was mostly America who was taking the burden and bearing the brunt of that. We also acquiesced to underdeveloped nations' desire not to modernize. So instead of saying, hey, we will allow you, I mean, of course, you don't have to modernize, but we're not going to support you if you're not going to modernize, what we said is, well, you should have a right not to modernize, and we'll just go ahead and take care of you because you're not going to modernize. And again, that's the wrong approach. Instead of saying, hey, you're welcome to be who you want, that's fine, you're just not going to get the carrot. We're not going to hit you with a stick, but we're not going to give you the carrot. Instead, what we did is we gave them the carrot of national support, international support, and did not expect anything of them. We didn't expect them to actually grow their economy, modernize so that they wouldn't need, so that we could slowly wean them off of that support and turn them into a more industrialized modern nation. Interestingly, another thing that happened in the UN is that the smaller the country, the louder the voice. So we started playing down the voices of America, Russia, China, the European Union, and we started trying to promote the voices of smaller countries. Now, this has kind of faded away in the 2000s as geopolitical realities have come, like such as the Ukraine war, the China-Taiwan issue, and others. But generally speaking, what we were trying to do is promote the voices of cultures and countries that we said were underrepresented. So again, we had this upside down thing going on at the UN where the smaller countries were almost wagging the dog. The tail was wagging the dog. And instead of the big countries helping the little countries modernize and become what they needed to be, we said these little countries should have a right to voice what's wrong with the bigger countries, and we kind of allowed that to happen, which was really backwards, and it led to a lot of other issues, one of which was Western culture became designated as the enemy. So all the other cultures who didn't want to become Western cultures were not only accepted, but they were praised and promoted as being more sustainable, more fair, more equitable, more socially just, et al., and so on and so forth. And you saw a lot of countries, even within the UN, who were coming in and were actually adopting some of these policies, and that's how socialism began to spread, first in Russia, and then slowly it crept its way into Europe after the fall of Berlin, which has always been odd to me. You saw the results of the Berlin experiment, the splitting of Germany, and yet you took those policies that created the East Germany ghettos and horrific lifestyle, and you bring those into your countries. But it all came about because we saw these other cultures as being more equitable, more fair, quote unquote, and we wanted to bring those into our Western societies. Another thing that happened is that we decided that population control and population relocation was the best way forward for equal distribution. I am going to talk about that, and I'm going to bring some receipts here. So before you all think I'm just a right-wing wackadoo with my own whatever, I'm going to actually bring some stuff here from the UN that's going to show you exactly what I'm talking about. So when we look at the nature of what the UN has become, it has become anti-West. And it slowly, all the other members of the UN have drifted away from Western culture, a lot because they've been importing people who are not a part of Western culture and then not expecting or forcing them to assimilate to the new Western culture. Nations such as Britain, France, Germany, many of your Nordic countries have all begun to drift away from the Western society model, and that's even happening here in America. And the further we drift away from the Western society model, the more susceptible we become to these cultural initiatives by the UN. The UN became susceptible to it first because obviously it's the diplomats from these countries that are changing, that are now setting the model, and then all these other countries have followed suit. But again, I promised you receipts, so let's take a look at them. So, the first thing I'm going to show you is the World Population Plan of Action. Now, this document here comes from the 1970s. I believe it is 1974. Yes, here it is. 19 through 30 August of 1974. That's up here in the corner where you can see it. And in this document, it is based upon the 1960s document about how are we going to change what's going on in the world, how are we going to redistribute people, how are we going to redistribute the global resources in order to have the world be what we need it to be. So the first thing we're going to look at is point number 19. And we're going to find it here. And it says, recognizing that per capita use of world resources is much higher in the developed than in the developing countries, the developed countries are urged to adopt appropriate policies in population, consumption, and investment, bearing in mind the need for fundamental improvement in international equity. So if you think equity and this social justice trend is just a modern kind of American thing or modern globalist thing, it's not. It actually goes all the way back to 1974. And basically what they're saying here is that all of the countries in the West need to basically change how they live and change what they do in order to ensure that they're not consuming more than the other countries of the world. In other words, this is socialism. This is exactly what we talk about when we say international socialism. We're going to stop developed countries from consuming and doing what they do and living how they live in order to better distribute those resources to other countries that are undeveloped. However, we're not going to expect anything of those countries, because remember we were talking about just a minute ago how we're going to give out all this international aid, but we're not going to expect anybody to not modernize. We're not going to expect them to westernize. We're not going to expect them to become something that they're not. We're just going to keep going ahead and paying them out. That is what we're talking about, and you can see that right here, the roots of that right here in this point. Now, let's skip to point number 37, and it reads, in light of the principles of this plan of action, countries which consider their birth rates detrimental to their national purpose are invited to consider setting quantitative goals and implementing policies that may lead to the attainment of such goals by 1985. Nothing herein should interfere with the sovereignty of any government to adopt or not to adopt such quantitative goals. Now again, that will change after the 1970s. When we approach the 1980s, there's more written between this document and the original document, and they actually go so far as to recommend that all countries institute the one-child policy that China had for a long time, which, by the way, we know now has completely fallen apart and failed. We were seeing the repercussions of that. But again, this is the UN's own documents. I'm not, and you can look up the 1980s version of this. There's been revised. The original came out in the 60s. You have the 74 version. You have like an 85 or 86 version. You have another one that came out in the 1990s. I believe it got a facelift in the 2000s. And we're going to show you another one coming from the year 2000 here in a second that will show you that none of this has changed. This has only continued. And again, I'm not reading to you from some right-wing conspiracy blog. This is directly from the UN documents. You can look these up. These are available to the public from the UN, so you can see what they're planning, what they're doing, and yeah, you can see why. You may agree with them, you may not, but at least you can do your own homework and see if you agree with me or whether you think I'm crazy. All right, let's go down to point number 51. In point number 51, it says, it is recommended that governments and international organizations generally facilitate voluntary international movement. In other words, if people want to immigrate, you should let them. However, such movements should not be based on racial considerations. In other words, you can't do it because you want to stay whatever your race is. Now, everybody's going to jump to white, but we're going to talk in a little bit about another group that's going to surprise you that is doing it specifically for these reasons, which are to the detriment of indigenous populations. The significance of international migration varies widely among countries depending upon their area, population size and growth rate, social and economic structure, and environmental conditions. In other words, what they want to see is more migration. More migration, less population. And again, I want you to hold on to that. More migration, less population. We don't want these developed countries to grow. We want them to begin bringing in foreigners. In other words, equally distributing the population around the countries of the globe, because you can't stop the undeveloped countries from having all these children because we failed in properly educating them. And why have we done that? Because we're not westernizing them. We're not modernizing them. We're allowing them to stay who they have always been. And then when they continue to have the issues that they've always had, we say, well, the solution is to bring a bunch of them into the developed countries and allow them to be there so that there's equitable populations around the globe. And then when there are equitable populations around the globe, we'll get a more equitable distribution of the supplies and the commodities that life runs on. So, moving on from this, let's take a look at the replacement migration study from the UN. This came out in 21 March 2000, or March 21st of 2000, and it is replacement migration. Now again, you guys hear the right talk about great replacement theory. It's not based on nothing. That's not something where it comes out of nowhere. It comes out of this document right here. But what, you've never seen it, most likely. Why have you never seen it? Because people don't want to do the homework and bring you the receipts. And again, that's what I'm trying to do. So let's go ahead and look at page 127. In the absence of migration, all countries with fertility below replacement level will see their population size start declining at some point of time in the near future, if it is not already the case today. In some countries, the projected declines in population size during the first half of the 21st century are as high as a quarter or a third of the entire population of the country. Now, guys, how did we get there? We got there because the 1960s, 1974, 1980s documents urged every Western country to institute policies that lowered birth rates. The goal was to lower birth rates, to decline the population of the globe. And since they said in the 1980s, they said, since we haven't been successful at decreasing the population in these third world countries, what we need to do instead is decline the population in the first world countries and have more migration. And here they're just kind of codifying that. They're saying, well, since we were successful in reducing the birth rates in the first world nations who now need people in order to work jobs and support their thing, the solution is to take people from the third world and move them to the first world. Again, this is not some conspiracy theory, guys. Here it is in the UN's own writing, and this is where it comes from. Later on it reads, while below replacement fertility is a major cause of population decline and population aging, even A sudden sharp increase in fertility in the short to medium term would not substantially alter the situation regarding the potential support ratios. In other words, even if you have a spike in population growth for a short term, it's not going to change things. Your countries in the West are still going to continue declining because we have really indoctrinated people with 2 kids is already too much. You should really be only having 1, and you don't really want all those kids. So we're not replacing ourselves. If 2 people have 1 kid and that happens across the entire population, you're not even replacing the 2 people who had the 1 kid. When your population declines, everything from Social Security to public funding to everything that our social safety net is built on begins to fall apart, because they're all built on the fact that you will have a larger generation coming behind in order to hold up the older generation that is passing away. Well, when you have no younger generation that is bigger, when every subsequent generation is smaller, they can't hold up. They can't afford to hold up the generation before them. And so the solution is we're going to import those people. As it continues, of course, as was shown earlier in this report, the potential support ratios could be maintained at current levels by increasing the upper limit to the working age population. In most cases, the upper limit would need to be raised to roughly 75 years. In other words, no 65 retirement, it's now 75. However, if retirement ages remain essentially where they are today, increasing the size of the working age population through international migration is the only option in the short to medium term to reduce the declines in the potential support ratio. So notice, not once do they say that the goal should be for developed nations to begin encouraging people to have children, to basically create within their own culture, within their own peoples, within their own group, the higher numbers of people needed in order to support themselves. They're saying, no, you don't need to do any of that. What you really need to do instead is start bringing in all of these other people from all over the world through migration in order to support yourself. Never mind that they don't share a language, they don't share a culture, they don't share your religion, they don't share your ideals, they don't share anything about you. We're just going to go ahead and bring them all in, as many as we can pack in order to make things work. And if your country changes, well, hey, that's just part of it. We're all one big global community now. Guys, I'm telling you, this is not, here it is in black and white. And again, you can look all of this up. This is all publicly available. Continuing, the present study considers countries where current fertility ranges from 1.2 to 2 children per woman. So in other words, the family is having anywhere from 1.2 kids to 2 kids to replace 2 people. Guys, that's unsustainable. It's just not sustainable. For France, United Kingdom, the United States, and the European Union, the number of migrants needed to offset population decline are less than or comparable to recent past experience. While this is also the case for Germany and the Russian Federation, their migration flows in the 1990s were relatively large due to the reunification and dissolution, respectively. In contrast, for Italy, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and Europe, the level of immigration, much higher than experienced in the recent past, would be needed to offset population decline. This higher level of immigration for Italy, Japan, and Europe would result in 18 to 29% of the 2050 population being post-1995 immigrants and their descendants. For the Republic of Korea, the comparable figure is about 3%. Wow. Half of their country would be immigrants. Guys, that is not a cultural fluke. That is purposeful cultural engineering. We are attempting, or the UN is attempting, to destroy culture, to create a homogenous global culture of anything and everything is acceptable, and we're all just one people, and we all just want to get along, and forget who you were, and forget who you are, and forget everything that makes you whoever you are. We're just going to throw all that away, and we're going to embrace this new we're all one people culture. Guys, this is not just some crazy theory. You're seeing it here in black and white. And furthermore, if you look at society, honestly look at society, you're going to see the same thing. But I promised you earlier that we're going to take a look at a culture that is fighting back. There are others too. We can look at Javier Milei. We can look at El Salvador and their president. We can look at the United States with Trump. We can look at Italy with Giorgia Meloni. We can look at a number of different places. Even France, to a certain extent, though not nearly to the other extents, has finally had a bellyful of this. But if you look at what's happening in Japan, it will shock you. Japan just passed a whole set of laws aimed at foreigners 10 years before you can apply to become a Japanese citizen. Proficiencies for Japanese reading, writing, and speaking. Understanding and proficiencies for the culture of Japan. Making sure that you are actually being culturally appropriate to how Japan is and who they want to be as a culture. And it is all due to their new Prime Minister, Takaichi. We're going to watch a video here that's going to tell us a little bit more about that. We're going to watch the first couple minutes of it because I want you to see what's going on so you can see that this is not just an America thing. This is not just a Trump thing. This is happening all over the world, and we are just on the early cusp of it.
There's a rise in anti-foreigner sentiment in Japan. Japan is anti-immigration and xenophobic. At least that's what the mainstream news headlines and narrative would have you believe. But is that really true? The global rise in anti-immigration sentiment is unmistakable, from the US to the UK and Europe to even South Korea. Both the pro and anti-immigration sides claim to have facts and truth on their side. Japan appears to be no exception. You can find YouTube and TikTok videos of street demonstrations in Tokyo and political parties campaigning on Japan First platforms. Oh, and did you know that Japan just elected its first female prime minister, whose hardline stance on immigration control is winning her a 78% approval rating, as well as praise and support from President Trump? Here's a story that caught my attention. In October 2025, residents of Kuchan, a small but world-famous ski resort town in Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost prefecture, launched a petition with 4,000 signatures to block the construction of a foreign worker dormitory. The proposed facility would house 1,200 seasonal workers, most of them foreigners from Southeast Asia, who are needed to run the ski resorts and construction sites. Residents cited concerns about noise, garbage, and nighttime safety. One petition organizer said that she felt as if they were becoming foreigners in their own town. After all, 1,200 workers would be 10% of the town's entire population in a single complex. But here's what's interesting. The same town has been struggling with closed shops and an aging population for years. The local convenience store can barely stay open because there aren't enough workers. So you have this fascinating contradiction. Locals protesting the foreign workers who are needed to serve the foreign tourists whose money keeps their town alive. There is no denying that Japan is very different from Western countries like the US. It's an extremely homogeneous society with over 97% ethnically Japanese. And it's historically been a very closed-off country, which we will get into in a bit. But setting all the emotions and politics aside, we decided to do our own research to share to the best of our knowledge what Japan's immigration policy is actually like. By the end of this video, hopefully you can form your own opinion on Japan's approach to immigration. Of course, this requires us to go beyond the headlines and get into the nuances because, believe it or not, there are crucial differences between legal immigration and illegal immigration, as well as between highly skilled workers and low-skilled laborers. What about temporary work visas versus permanent residency? We need to get into all that because this is unfolding right before our eyes, while ordinary Japanese citizens are dealing with rising costs, a housing crisis, and the reality that their country is losing around 900,000 Japanese nationals every year. 16 consecutive years of population decline. Let's dive right in.
So what I hope that you took away from that video is that it is not just an American thing. We're not dealing with some kind of odd American thing that is happening only within our country. This is a global movement towards civilizationalism. Now, those of you who watch me on this channel, you may not be as aware of it, but if you followed my writings for some time or follow me on Facebook or any of those, you'll know I'm a big fan of Dr. Steve Turley. I happen to agree with a lot of his political science views on things. Again, his doctorate and his education is gives him an interesting and unique perspective over a lot of people who look at things with an emotional mindset. Well, he can look at them through a political science lens and really begin to give us views that we don't often see. And he clued us into the fact that the shift that is happening within public policy, particularly within geopolitics, is towards a civilizationalist worldview. So, a power center such as the Western Hemisphere, overseen by America. America is not going to let another power center exist in the Western Hemisphere. So America is basically taking over the Western Hemisphere side of things, so there's not much to talk about there. We're going to just leave that alone. However, on the flip side, you have the Russian center that is building, you have the Chinese center that is building, you have the India center that is building and is competing with China over some of those Southeast Asian islands and territories. Japan is kind of out on its own, just like Europe, and we'll talk about Europe in a second. But Japan will probably become part of the America power projection sphere, because they don't have enough power on their own to be on their own, but at the same time, they're Western enough that they don't want to fall in with either the Chinese or the Russian bloc. So you're probably going to see them stay with America. Africa at this point doesn't have enough to become a power center, and I don't see them signing on with anybody. You've got some mercenaries currently running between Africa and Russia for those high pay contracts that Russia was giving out, but now that Russia's defaulting on them, you have those countries, specifically Nigeria, Chad, and I believe the other was Congo, but I could be wrong, don't quote me on that one, who are now warning their citizens, don't take these deals, don't go to Russia, these are fake deals, you're not going to get the money, and you're probably going to get killed before you even have the opportunity to receive that money, because you're just being used as cannon fodder, you're not being seen as equal combat participants. And this is kind of a dirty, underhanded trick that Russia's been playing. So I don't see Africa becoming a major player in the new global power scale. Europe is an interesting wild card, as is the Middle East. So let's talk about the Middle East first, because Europe's going to take some explaining. So the Middle East will be interesting because it's going to really hinge a lot on what happens in Iran. As you know, there's a lot of political upheaval right now in Iran, and Iran does kind of is the co-hedge of culture there in the Middle East. You have Iran and then you have Saudi Arabia, and they both kind of go back and forth as to who's the head of Middle Eastern culture. Now, with the Iranian regime falling, if it becomes a secular state as opposed to an Islamic state like Saudi is, if it can become a truly secular state, instead of having the two forms of Islam fighting against each other for control of the Middle East, you'll have the secular Middle East versus the religious Middle East, and it will become a very different power dynamic. And we'll have to see kind of who comes out on the top of that one as to what if the whole Middle East begins to move towards a more secular movement and away from Islamic control, you could see them essentially become a kind of a united alliance, and they might be able to put together a power sphere within that world. However, if the powers that be, the Islamic powers that be, maintain some kind of hold in Iran, in Iran's future, you're never going to get away from that conflict between Saudi and Iran, and it's going to prevent them from forming any kind of genuine power structure. And you'll have them constantly back and forth at each other's throats, and neither one's going to be able to get ahead, and that whole region is not going to be able to advance. Europe could go a couple of ways. First of all, Europe could theoretically become its own power center. They have enough people, they have enough production. Their GDP is, comparable to the U.S. in many ways. Maybe not as high, but in terms of quantity of goods, the quality of goods, the number of types of goods that are manufactured. Europe is genuinely a rival to the U.S. when you look at the whole of Europe as a power center. Now, the question is that what Europe wants? Do they want to kind of become their own thing and do their own thing? Well, if you ask France, the answer is yes. If you ask Britain, the answer is no. If you ask Germany, the answer is only if we're in charge. So again, Europe has a lot that they have to kind of sort through and suss through and how they want to do things. And as always, there's so much disagreement and so much bickering and fighting going on between those countries. There's really no reliable way to predict what will happen with that power center. It is possible that option number 2 is some of Europe decides to stay in the U.S. power center, while some of Europe becomes its own power center. In doing that, the other power center in Europe, the one that doesn't stay with the U.S., will become kind of a very weak power center because it's not the whole of Europe, and it's what it wants and who it wants to be and how it wants to function, but it would still technically be a power center. And then the most unlikely is that Europe or part of Europe joins with the Russian power sphere in order to actively promote its cultural agenda and its cultural civilization. But basically, these are the power centers, and they're all built around cultures and civilizations. You have the Western civilization represented by America. That is, the traditional Western civilization is represented by America in the Western Hemisphere. You have the Russosphere, which is Russia and all of the states that they are attempting to take over in order to keep up their imperial identity and nation state. And really their czar vision that Putin has. He kind of envisions himself as being the next czar of Russia. Then you have China, which sees wants to see its influence continue to expand throughout all of Asia and out into the Pacific. China's immediate goal is Taiwan, but make no mistake, it has its eyes on South Korea, it has its eyes on Japan, it has its eyes on Indonesia, it has its eyes on the Philippines, it has its eyes on many of the small islands that the U.S. currently uses to power project into the Chinese, what they view as their sovereign right of power, and these little Pacific islands that really aren't big enough for a population center, the likes of which we would call a city, are crucial for us being able to base our planes and move our ships out into that area, our aircraft carriers, to power project to counter China's design, such as our island breakout policy, prevention policy, which prevents China from breaking out from the islands between, kind of, if you'll forgive me, the crude geographic idea, from Japan down to Australia. We use those islands and different military things, submarines, detection, satellite systems, different operations in order to make sure that China cannot break out into open waters with their military vessels in order to cause havoc in the U.S. fleets and international trade, should they decide to get a little froggy, to use an old 1990s term, and begin fighting with everyone. And then you also have India. Now, India is a rival with China. They don't like each other very much. And here's the thing. Right now, people are going to be mad at me because they're going to say, BRICS, 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 BRICS. Understand something about BRICS. BRICS, if you think that Europe and the U.S. are having a tiff, you ain't seen nothing. The BRICS nations hate each other. The Russians and Chinese have fought a number of wars, and they are actively on defense against each other. They are allies on paper only, and both of them knows at any time that could break up and turn into something completely different. India can't stand China. It sees China as an unreliable partner. China has backed Pakistan, which is the mortal enemy of India, that India still views as part of who they are, whereas Pakistan views it as being a sovereign and completely separate nation. But China also hates Japan. China hates Taiwan. China hates Korea. And they really feel that all of those nations should be under Chinese power and Chinese power projection, including all the rare earth minerals, all the lithograph machines for the chips and manufacturers. They should all be under Chinese control so that China has the ability to control the global markets on these things that are crucial for our national defense, for just how we run. Trust me, microprocessors are in everything we use. There is almost nothing you use that doesn't require a microprocessor, even if not in the device itself, in something that that device is attached to. Our entire society runs on them. And if China controls the entire world's supply and ability to create microprocessors, everything changes in the world. This is the kind of power and civilizationalist world that we are slowly turning into. The idea of all nations being equal, this old UN idea, is quickly disappearing. Russia's gobbling up all the little people that it can. China is starting to gobble up and wants to gobble up the little people. India is already eyeing how can we bring Pakistan back in. And if you don't think they have eyes on Afghanistan, some of the islands that are underneath and south of them, and possibly moving on towards the Middle East, then you really aren't projecting out properly for what is going to be happening in the next probably century to century and a half. These power structures really genuinely are going to define the next 100 to 150 years of geopolitics. The old order of every nation is important, every nation has an equal voice is gone. It's not just going, it's gone. And if you don't believe me, just look at the fact that the UN, no matter how much it threatens, no matter what it does, no matter how many weapons it sends to Ukraine, it cannot get Russia to even come to the table in genuine good faith to talk about it, because Russia basically says, we want all of Ukraine, and that's all there is to it. China's going to do the same thing with Taiwan. We already know it's coming. And here's the thing. We're either going to understand this reality and respond to it, or we're going to try to keep what we believe it should be and watch as all of the things around us get trampled on by these other things. And too late, just like we got into World War I too late, just like we got into World War II too late, we're going to be left behind playing catch up because we didn't read the geopolitics of what was happening correctly. This is our chance to read it correctly and to be at the forefront of what the new movement and the new global order, instead of playing catch up on the back end. That is the biggest thing that Trump and his administration is doing. They are building from the front instead of from the rear. They are seeing the trend and meeting it instead of letting things go to heck in a handbasket and then, oh, well, now I guess we have to get involved and play this game because they've already changed it. Well, we're gonna see it changing. We're gonna change along with it in order to make sure that they can't send the entire world into an upheaval, and we're gonna be caught trying to figure out how in the world we're going to work from this point forward. We're going to get out in front of it and be proactive as opposed to sitting back and being reactive. So the reality that you have to understand, as much as you may not like it, as much as it may upset you, as much as it may make you want to scream and yell at people, the old global liberal order is dying. It is on life support, and it is most likely already dead. The UN and all of their UN things are a relic of the past. They're feckless, they're useless, they're going away, and pretty soon it's going to be, what does my power center do? What does my power center want? How does my power center operate? And how do I function within it? That's scary. I get it, because we like to think that the world can become a just place and a this and a that. But the reality is, the UN dream, it may come back around again, but it's not going to be in the next 100 to 150 years. Because the reality is, there are people out there who just don't want to be a part of it. And you can't sit and wish that they would to your own detriment. You have to respond to the situations that are in front of you. And Russia, China, and India, they're not going to allow us to continue with this liberal world order. They're going to thumb their nose at us. They're going to thumb their nose at the UN. They don't care. They're going to keep doing what they want. And you know what, guys? That is the new reality that we have to deal with. How are we going to deal with these rising power centers? How are we going to counter their moves? It cannot be in a UN courtroom. It can't be in some international criminal court and yada, 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 yada. The only thing that is going to change the trajectory of where this world is going is if we solidify a power structure. We say, China, we don't need you. Russia, we don't need you. And we're going to be able to support ourselves. And if you want to continue to destroy the world, we're going to meet you head on. So are we in a new Cold War? Yeah, I guess that's one way you could see it. But it's not one that we chose. It's not one that we made, but it is one that we need to win. Guys, sorry to bring you some bad news, but I want you to be informed. I want you to understand these things so that as you move forward and see things that are being done by presidents, not just this one, but presidents, both Republican and Democrat, because it doesn't matter how much. If a Democrat comes into office, he might want to change it. He might want to go back to the UN. He might want to this. He might want to that. It doesn't matter what he wants, because the other side with the power to actually start a war and sustain it doesn't want that. And if you can't make a one-sided treaty. We learned that. That was the lesson of World War II. You cannot make a one-sided treaty. You just can't. So, I appreciate your time. I love you guys. Please remember, hit the like, hit the subscribe button so that you can see more from me as I keep kind of producing these videos. Let me know if there's another topic you want me to hit up, and I'll do some research and see if I can't put it together for you. Anyway, you guys have a great one. Bye-bye.